Tommy loved Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson was Tommy's 6th grade teacher. And Mr. Johnson drove a red convertible sports car, had a master's degree in science, told funny jokes, and had a pretty fiancée. And boy, Tommy thought that Mr. Johnson was the greatest teacher he'd ever had. Mr. Johnson made learning fun. It was the first time in Tommy's life that he had really liked learning something. He loved going to Mr. Johnson's science class and learning all about the different things Mr. Johnson was teaching. And sometimes Mr. Johnson would take Tommy in the class and they would do nature walks. And on the nature walk, Mr. Johnson would say, "Class, isn't it interesting how this plant evolved the ability to do this?" Or, "Isn't it interesting how this beetle evolved the ability to fly?" And now, Tommy never really thought much about those ideas. He had always been taught that God created the world and God created Adam and Eve. And he was taught the Bible growing up, went to Bible class and went to church all the time. And so hey, isn't it interesting how this beetle evolved or whatever, never really dawned on Tommy. And when they studied the dinosaurs, Mr. Johnson talked about dinosaurs being separated from humans by millions of years, but that never really hit Tommy either. In fact, Tommy didn't really understand what was going on until today. Today, Mr. Johnson stood up and said, "Class, we're going to be learning how the universe started. Can anyone tell me how that happened?" But Eugene Lipton shot his hand up in there. Now, Eugene Lipton was the 6th grader who read his science textbook for fun. Eugene said, "Yes, sir, I can." And Mr. Johnson said, "Go ahead, Eugene." Eugene said, "About 13.7 billion years ago, a tiny ball of singularity exploded in what is commonly referred to as the Big Bang." And he went into the textbook spiel on how the universe supposedly got here. Mr. Johnson said, "Great work." He said, "Can anyone else tell me how life got here?" And Katie raised her hand and said, "Yes, I can." And Mr. Johnson said, "Go ahead." And Katie said, "About 4.5 billion years ago, a warm chemical soup was on the surface of the earth, and something like lightning struck that warm chemical soup and caused an amoeba to form it." Very good, Katie. Thank you. Now, Tommy had a problem because Tommy knew that that is not what he had been taught. In fact, Tommy knew that he had been taught that God created the world in 6 days and God created humans, and evolving from an amoeba certainly wasn't part of the Bible that he had been taught. And you know what? The truth was 28 out of the 32 kids that were in the class had been taught the exact same thing that Tommy had been taught. This was totally new to them. Well, one young man raised his hand, Stephen. And Mr. Johnson said, "Yes, Stephen. Do you have a question?" And Stephen said, in a very brave but nervous voice, he said, "Mr. Johnson, that's not right." He said, "God created the world in 6 days." Now, Tommy whipped his head back around to see what Mr. Johnson was going to do with that, because, yeah, that's exactly what he had been taught too. And how in the world was Mr. Johnson going to answer this? And Tommy was surprised when Mr. Johnson started smiling. And Mr. Johnson said, "Stephen, thank you so much for bringing that up. Where did your dad get that idea?" And Stephen said, "From the Bible." Mr. Johnson said, "That's exactly what I thought." And Mr. Johnson walked back to his desk and opened his top left-hand drawer and pulled out a leather-bound Bible. And he said, "Stephen, did your dad's Bible look anything like this?" And it had. And so Mr. Johnson turned over to Genesis chapter 1 and he said, "Class, let's read a little of this." I'm sure glad Stephen brought that up because I was hoping someone would. And he started reading about God maketh and doeth and hath and hast. And he said, "Class, does this sound like an old book?" I mean, they had to admit it did sound old. And he said, "This is an old book." He said, "It's got some good ideas about how to treat others, some good moral principles, doing to others as you want them to do to you." But he said, "This book, for modern scientific ideas, it's outdated. It's wrong." In fact, he said with a chuckle, "You know, the people who wrote this book thought that the world was flat and had corners." And he turned over to the Psalms and read about how the wind came from the 4 corners of the earth. And he said, "Can you believe that? That some people actually believe that the world was flat and had corners?" And with that, he closed the Bible and put it back in his drawer and went about teaching his atheistic evolution. Does that happen? In one sense, that's a fictitious story. No Mr. Johnson, no Tommy. In another sense, that story has happened thousands and thousands of times across this country and literally all over the world. I wish I could say that wasn't the case. Just in Ringgold, Georgia, not far from here, I know a man who had been teaching science, about 6th grade science, for 17 years, had been teaching the problems of evolution, teaching the qualities and characteristics of creation that make it a much better explanation. The assistant superintendent of the school went to him and said, "You cannot teach creation anymore." He said, "Fine, I'll just teach the problems of evolution." She said, "No, you cannot teach those either. You teach exactly what's in the book and that's it." I was talking to a grandmother whose 3rd grade grandson attends the Williamson County School System right outside of Nashville, Tennessee. She said, my 3rd grade grandson was in his class, and they have a period of time called Drop Everything and Read. And you're supposed to just be able to bring any book that you want from home to read. He brought the Bible. His teacher in 3rd grade said, "Do not bring a Bible to Drop Everything and Read class. We don't want that in here. You cannot bring it here. You bring something else from home. Or you can bring any book you want in the world except the Bible." Apparently that's what the situation was. I was outside of Washington, D.C. in Maryland. Junior in high school sat across the table from me as we were eating dinner after a seminar very similar to this. And he said, "You know, in my school you can't read the Bible." I said, "What do you mean you can't read the Bible?" He said, "I was reading it in my study hall period in the counselor's office, sitting there by myself reading my Bible. The assistant principal came by. She saw me reading the Bible. She said, 'Do not read your Bible at this school. Close that. I don't want to see it again.'" His 8th grade brother explained to me that you could go into the library and you could type in Bible and all the sites were blocked that would take you to any internet sites on the Bible. I said, "Can you get sites Quran and stuff?" He said, "Yeah, you can get Quran and other religions, stuff like that, just not the Bible." Folks, I wish it was the case that that scenario with Tommy and Mr. Johnson did not happen, but it does. In fact, I'll tell you why. This man's name, Daniel Dennett, he was recognized as one of the 4 horsemen, one of the leading atheists in the world. He says that if you teach your kid anything other than evolution, and you send your kid to a school system over which he has any influence or authority, he said those of us who have the freedom of speech will feel free to describe your teachings as the spreading of falsehoods, and will attempt to demonstrate this to your children at our earliest opportunity. You send your kids to our school and you've taught them that God created the world in 6 literal 24-hour days, and He made Adam from the dust, and He made Eve from Adam's rib, and we're going to explain that you're a liar. You're spreading falsehoods, and the real story is 13.7 billion years ago, the universe came into existence from a huge explosion, and life evolved from primordial slime. That's what they'll say the real story is. Now, when you ask them for evidence to verify that, they're going to give you what they claim is evidence. But what I'm going to show you is that if you look at what they're calling evidence critically and you carefully consider it, you're going to realize that what's being taught as evidence for evolution is no such thing, and somebody is spreading falsehoods. Someone is. But guess who it's not? It's not the creationists. Someone's lying, and we've been knowing they're lying for years, and somehow we haven't heard about that. Let me give you an example of that. This is the English peppered moth. English peppered moth, if you were a bird, which one of these 2 would you eat? You say, "Kyle, don't ask me a silly question like that. I don't know which one I'd eat because I've never been a bird." No, of course you're not a bird. You can't even think like a bird. But the scenario is that if you were to look at this, you would eat that darker colored one because you could see it better. The lighter colored one is camouflaged, and you can't see it, and so that's why the population is 95% light colored and 5% dark colored. But then the story in the textbooks is that after the Industrial Revolution, the soot from the trees caused the soot from the factories caused the trees to be blackened, killed the lichens. Now if you're a bird, which one of these 2 do you eat? Oh, of course, now you eat the light-colored one. The dark-colored one stays safe, and so the population shifts from 95% light to 95% dark, and the 5% alters as well. And that's what we're told is, if you're looking at this closely, evolution in action. We're told that this is an example of evolution. We just watched it happen in our lifetime. We saw evolution taking place. Now, just a quick question. What did these moths evolve into? Oh, they had the genetic information before the Industrial Revolution to have dark and light colored moths, and they had the genetic information after the Industrial Revolution to have dark and light colored moths. They evolved into what? Nothing. They were moths the whole time, and they didn't evolve into anything. Now hold on just a second.